Hello and welcome to the first part of this more practical episode that will be dedicated to working with Kafka. And this first part will be specifically about producers. So the proper prerequisite before doing anything with Kafka would be installing Kafka itself on your local environment, but the installation process is beyond the scope of this tutorial as it's actually notoriously difficult to do it right on macOS, and just doing brew install will not always work, so you might want to check Docker out, and this should really simplify the entire process. But as far as the application goes, this is really straightforward, and you will see that producing messages to Kafka will be really way simpler than you can imagine. So I've already established an example race application just to show something more interesting instead of just showing some boilerplate code and how to set up the Rails application. So obviously the first thing that we will need will be a Karafka gem here, because we'll be using Karafka for the communication with Kafka. And the next step will be configuring the producer. So I created an initializer in config initializers directory. It's karafka.rb. And surprisingly enough, it's not a Karafka setup, but it's a waterdrop setup. So waterdrop is part of the Karafka stack, but it's actually a separate gem. Well, it's basically the gem for producing messages to Kafka, which is used under the hood by what in Karafka is called responders, which is actually the recommended way how to publish messages to Kafka, but you can also use waterdrop standalone itself. So let's review the config options that we need to get started. So the first one will be client ID, which is, well, basically to be able to distinguish between different clients connecting to Kafka. So I call it Kafka example here. The next one will be whether we want to deliver the messages to the real Kafka or not. So that's the configuration option to ensure that for all but test environments, we will be publishing messages to real Kafka, and for test environment, we'll be storing them in memory storage. The third one is perhaps the most important, which is basically the URI to Kafka Brokers. So I specified the one that I have locally, and it will be probably on this port if you don't use Docker but use the local Kafka. And the next step is specifying the logger. So here it's just race logger. As the next step, we'll need to create the application responder class, because we are not going to use waterdrop standalone, but responders that actually use waterdrop under the hood. So it's really just a base class that is inheriting from Karafka base responder class. And our last step will be creating some example responder that will be inheriting from this application responder class. So here it is. It's a page visited responder, which is example responder that might be used for website activity tracking. So let's see what is going on here. So at the top we have some declarations, and what we are doing here is declaring topics: pages topic and visits topic. So a good thing to keep in mind is that one responder is not coupled to a single topic. One responder can respond or publish to multiple topics, but it's just the thing that those topics need to be declared somewhere. So here I declared pages topic and visits topic. There could be a couple of more topics, and it doesn't really mean that I have to publish messages to all of them. I can just publish to one of them, to two of them, to all of them, like depending on the needs. And the next thing is respond method that takes some payload. So what's going on in this method's body? So the first thing is that we are going to respond to pages topic. So this is basically the way to publish messages. The second argument is the events body. And then we have a couple of options. So the first option that we can pass is partition key. And this is basically, if you have multiple partitions and you want to distribute the messages properly, you will either want to specify the partition key, which will be used to resolve to which partition a given message should be published to, or you can specify partition directly if you know what you are doing. But it's recommended to always use partition key and deterministically publish to a specific partition. And another one is key, which is very useful when you care about log compaction, because that way you will be able to store only the latest projection of a given thing. And yeah, this is really that simple to build some example responder. There are a couple of more configuration options that we could use here, which I'm going to cover in advanced Karafka. And one of them will be, for example, using a different serializer, because by default the Karafka uses a JSON serializer, but what we can do is, for example, use XML serializer or Avro serializer, which is a popular format in Kafka. Okay, so now that we have all the components of our application built, let's have some fun from the console. So I was already having some fun. As you can see, there are a couple of output logs here. So let me repeat this. So when we are using responders, we don't call this respond method directly, but what we do is we call method, in which we pass the payload that we actually want to be passed to the respond method. So I'm publishing the message, and I use the message key because this was exactly what was used here. As you can see, there's a payload fetch message. For partition key, it's fetch partition key, and for key, it's payload fetch key. So exactly we have all these keys here. So the message is just going to be a user ID that visited the page. Well, probably it would be useful to include some website URL or something like this, but well, it's not really important for the demonstration purposes. So next we have partition key and the key, which is like user and the ID of this user. So let's call this method and see what happens. So we have some debug output, some current leader for this partition, and for this topic and for this partition, some connection has been unused for too long, so the Kafka needs to be, so we need to reconnect to a Kafka broker. Then we have the fact that we are opening the connection, sending the produce API request 1, and all these requests are counted. As you can see, the counter will increase with each consecutive call method. And well, it's waiting for the response. We've got the confirmation that the response was received, and we have the message that the message was successfully appended to this topic pages and partition 0. And yeah, it's really that simple. And also you can see that it was serialized using JSON serializer. So that would be really it for the producer's part. It's really that simple to implement a producer using Karafka, and in a moment I will show you how to work with the consumer.